What's going on guys, Jin here, and this is my updated guide for a no Uber Frozen Orb build. I've cleared up to tier 93 of the pit with this build, although it was very sweaty at the boss. And it's also soloed 4 of the tormented bosses. So of course it clears 75 to 85 pits pretty quickly, and allows you to farm some of that Neatheron for max level masterworking. So if you enjoy these kinds of guides, like, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment as it helps out a lot. Now onto the build. For the skill tree we're going to take 2 into Firebolt, 5 into Frozen Orb, going for Greater Frozen Orb, 1 in Devastation, 3 in Elemental Dominance. In defensive skills we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, 1 into Teleport, and go for Shimmering Teleport, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, and go for Shimmering Ice Armor. In our Conjuration skills, we're going to go for 1 into Hydra, to get Summoned Hydra for the burn damage. Then we're going to go for Ice Blades, and Summoned Ice Blades. We'll also take 3 in Conjuration Mastery, 1 in Align the Elements, for the 3 in Mana Shield and Protection. Then we go to our Mastery skills, taking 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. In our ultimate skills, we take 2 into Permafrost, and 3 into Hoarfrost, Frigid Breeze, and Icy Touch. We're also taking Unstable Currents, and Prime Unstable Currents. And for our key passive, we're going to take Via's Mastery. That pretty much wraps up the skill tree. Let's go to the Paragon board. So for the starting board I'm going with Tactician. That's going to give us 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. The duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. Pretty straightforward there. For our second board we're going to go with the Enchantment Master board. And we're going to go for the Elementalist Glyph, so dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. For our third board, we're going to take the Icefall board, so our frost skills deal 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, double the bonus if the enemy is also frozen. And we're going to put in the Reinforced Glyph here, so we gain 15% damage reduction while we have an active barrier. So that helps a lot with our tankiness. For our fourth board, we're going to go with the Frigid Fate board. So we're taking the legendary node here, dealing bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equals 10% of the total amount of our bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 30%, which is what we have currently. For the glyph we're taking Territorial for the damage to close enemies, but also we gain 15% damage reduction against close enemies. So again, helping out with our tankiness. For our fifth board, we've got Burning Instinct. And we're going to put in the Destruction Glyph for the critical strike damage. And critical strikes also increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. For our sixth board, we've got the Ceaseless Conduit board. And we're going to put in the Control Glyph. So we deal a lot of extra damage to crowd controlled enemies. But also we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. For our seventh board, we're going to take Searing Heat, and we're going to put in Exploit here for the extra vulnerable damage. And dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, and that stacks up to 10%. For our eighth and final board, we're taking the Static Surge board, and we're going to go for the Flame Feeder Glyph here, extra damage to burning enemies, which will be procced by our Hydra, which spawns from our necklace. And we also deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. So that pretty much wraps up the Paragon board, nice and simple. If I went too fast for you, all of this will be in the description in the build planner below, along with the skills and the gear and everything else, so make sure you check that out to go at your own pace. Next up for the gear. So for the gear, on the left I'll list the affixes and tempering you would want for each item. Starting with the helm, we're going to look for a Godslayer crown. That's going to give you max life, damage, CC duration and cooldown reduction. Also when you stun, freeze or immobilize an enemy elite or damage a boss, you'll pull in nearby enemies and deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds. This can happen once every 12 seconds. If you happen to have a Harlequin Crest, you would use that instead. As for the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the cooldown reduction on both of these items. If you don't happen to have either of those, you would want a helm with intelligence, armor, and cooldown reduction. And for the tempering, you would do total armor, and lucky hit % chance to stun. As for the masterworking, you would also go for the cooldown reduction. And for the aspect, you would use something like Disobedience here. Next up we have the chest piece. We're going to use something with intelligence, armor and mana per second. As for the tempering, go for total armor % and lucky hit % chance to freeze. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the intelligence. And for the aspect, we're going with Everliving here, so we get 10 to 25% less damage taken from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Next for the gloves, we're going to look for gloves with crit chance, ranks into Frozen Orb, and attack speed. We're going to try and temper that with cold damage, and lucky hit % chance to immobilize or stun if you don't have this stun on the helm. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and get the ranks into Frozen Orb up. And for the aspect, we're going to use Conceited, giving us 10 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. For the pants, we're going to go with Tibault's Will, that gives us potion capacity, maximum resource, damage, and damage reduction from close enemies. We also deal 10 to 20% increased damage while unstoppable and for 5 seconds after. And when we become unstoppable, we gain 50 of our primary resource. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and get the damage reduction from close enemies upgraded. If you don't have Tibault's Will, look for pants with intelligence, armor, and max life. And we're going to temper that with total armor % and lucky hit % chance to slow. As for the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the intelligence. And for the aspect, you're going to use the aspect of concentration. Next up we have the boots. We're going with Esu's Heirloom. That'll give us movement speed for 5 after killing an elite, crit strike damage and mana cost reduction. Also our crit strike chance is increased by 20 to 30% of our movement speed bonus. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and go for the movement speed here. If you don't have Esu's Heirloom, you would just use boots with move speed, mana per second, and intelligence. And you would temper that with move speed and immobilize duration. As for the aspect, you would use the aspect of Bending Conduit or Ghostwalkers, and for the masterworking, you would masterwork the move speed. Next up for the main hand, we're going to be looking for something with intelligence, vulnerable damage, and crit damage or max life. We're going to temper that with the chance for Frozen Orb projectiles to cast twice, and cold damage. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and get that on the Frozen Orb projectiles casting twice. Aspect wise, we're going with accelerating, so critical strikes with core skills increase our attack speed by 10 to 25% for 5 seconds. Next up we have the focus. We're going to look for something with crit chance, intelligence, and cooldown reduction. We're going to try and temper that with chance for Frozen Orb projectiles to cast twice and cold damage. Just like the main hand, we want to get the masterworking on the chance for Frozen Orb projectiles to cast twice. For the aspect, we're using Frozen Orbit, so our Frozen Orb explodes 2 more times at its destination for 45 to 60% of its damage. For the amulet, we're going to use the Fractured Winterglass here. That's going to give us vulnerable damage, non-physical damage, cooldown reduction, and conjuration mastery. Also, casting Frozen Orb has a 35 to 50% chance to spawn a random conjuration when it explodes. This is how we get our Hydra out, which will burn enemies, allowing our Flame Feeder glyph to activate. Also, on lucky hit, our conjurations have up to a 50 to 70% chance to launch a frozen orb at nearby enemies. As you can see, this necklace is really good and pretty much critical for this build. As for the masterworking, we would want to try and get that on the conjuration mastery. If you don't happen to have a fractured Winterglass, you would get something with crit chance, cooldown reduction and move speed. And as for the tempering, you would go for cold damage and move speed. And for the aspect, you would want to get something like Storm Swell here to get 30 to 45% more damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier active. Next up for the rings, we're going to go with Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That's going to give us non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource generation and cooldown reduction. Also, for each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 60%. And dealing any elemental damage refreshes all these bonuses. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction. If you happen to have a Ring of Starless Skies, you would use that as your secondary ring, and you would want to masterwork the crit chance or the core skill damage. If you don't happen to have either of those rings, then you would want to use a ring with intelligence, critical strike chance, and attack speed. And for the tempering, you'd want to temper cold damage and resource generation. For the masterworking, you would also masterwork the critical strike chance. As for the aspect, you would want to use Storm Swell here if you're using the fractured Winterglass. If not, then you would want to use the aspect of control, or the aspect of shredding blades, or both if you don't have the Talrash's or Ring of Starless Skies. Last but not least, we have the gems. I'm using 2 diamonds in the rings and 1 skull in the necklace. I'm using the blue gems, sapphires, in the weapon and offhand, although you can use the green gems. And in the armor, I'm using the red gems for the maximum life, although you can use the topazes, the yellow gems, for the 100 intelligence per gem. That pretty much wraps up this build. I generally farm tier 75 to 80 pits with this, but I've cleared a tier 93 with it. Again, this is without Ubers, without full masterworked gear, and without greater affixes on a lot of the items. So I hope this build guide helps you out and you have fun playing it. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment below as it helps out the channel a lot. Thanks for watching, hope to see you in the next video. Bye!